everybody has played games, right, and enjoyed them. But have you ever thought about how they are made? Like seriously. So today, our first speaker is Mr. Jivitesh Dhaliwal, who is currently a game developer at Tender Clause. He is an IGDA scholar and Eric Dybsand Memorial AI scholar, and he's here with us today to walk us through the whimsical world of game development. So I pass on to Mr. Jivitesh. So you can start sharing your screen, which I can see. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Mahir. And congratulations to UIT and to everybody who's on the organizing team. You guys are doing a fantastic job.
Thank
Just
you.
give me
Thank
1 second to set up my screen. Can you
sure.
guys hear me properly?
Yeah, sure. Definitely.
All right. All right. Well, I am really excited to be here with all of you and to share my learnings. I feel like it wasn't too long ago when we were organizing the very first Software Freedom Day. It has been quite a while, but I am so happy to see that you're continuing to flourish and you're continuing to do really amazing work. I am here in some capacity to talk about the video game development and what goes into making games. I'm kind of at the early stages of my career, but I've been fortunate to work with some really amazing people and some very interesting studios. So I would be excited to talk to you more about what I think games are, where they're headed, and how you can get involved in game creation. So my talk is called Level Up, Make Your Own Games. The idea behind this is that at the end of this conversation, you would have a framework on how to think about games and also the kinds of tools that you can use to make your own games. Like you mentioned, I really wish we were back in Punjab University. There is no substitute for the awesome food that we have at Software Freedom Day. But I am with you in spirit at Punjab University, even though I'm here actually in person at in New York. That's where I'm speaking from. And I'm super excited. So let's just close our eyes and imagine that we're back in Punjab University, maybe sitting in the Golden Jubilee Hall. Just for fun, I think that'll be really interesting. So basically, this talk is divided into 3 sections. The first section is talking about an idea of what games are and thinking about interactivity. In the second section, I'll introduce you to some of the game engines and some of the technologies and softwares that we use with somewhat of a focus on open source tools. And finally, I also want to touch a little bit about building your community and some old person advice about how you can think about your careers. And with that, I don't think you can hear this. Can you hear this? Sorry, just give me 1 second. Let me share my computer audio. Is this better? Can you hear this?
I think it's not audible.
Sound is not audible. Yeah, now it's audible.
So children are really interesting, right? They can have fun with anything. They will turn any object around them into a play object. And I want you to think back to a time when you were a kid and you were playing around with, you were hiding or making sandcastles or just running around. Anything for you at that moment was a plaything. And somewhere along the way, we tend to forget that idea. But I would like you to think back to one memory that comes to your mind. Maybe it was you at a swing with some of your friends or playing hide and seek. Just think back to that one idea and think back to why you maybe stopped having fun and playing around with everything around you. So games are also based on play. The core fundamental always remains about having fun and learning, but games add a formal element to play. For example, you will have players and you'll have rules, objectives, and resources. And these formal elements give some direction to the to the play that you want to have. Generally, when we think about digital games, we think about games like this one. Yeah, Fortnite is really huge at the moment, right? And there's always some game that's centered around shooting or action. They're really fun to play. But then there's also another kind of game that comes to mind when you think about digital games, right? I think you might be familiar with Candy Crush. Right? So generally, when we think about digital games, these are the kinds of games that come to our mind, primarily because they're the most popular kind of games. And well, they generally have the biggest marketing budgets. So you'll find advertisements for them all around. And they're also really fun to play, there's no doubt about it. But then I want to argue that all games are centered around interactions. And interactions happen around us all the time. So that interaction could be between you and a computer, an interaction between you and your grandparents, or just you talking to some people around you. There are so many different kinds of interactions happening all over all the time. And I want to argue that any of those interactions can be turned into a game. So, for example, this is a game called Journey, developed by an independent group called That Game Company, which is taking ideas and turning them, which is taking a story and turning it into a game. But you can also have games that are centered around your interaction with your loved ones. For example, this is called Dear Mom. It's made by one of my co-students, and it's centered around your love with your mother.
Thank you for everything.
So games can be, at its very core, games are the combination of art and technology, which is centered around interactivity. And interactivity for me has always been the core pillar of what games can be. Not just what they are right now, but what they can be in the future. I know that a lot of you are very interested in machine learning, in natural language processing, in really complex things like deep learning. And what I want to argue is that a lot of those technologies can be looked at from a lens of art and turned into interesting game ideas. So one of the um, one of my personal mission in life is to help my players understand themselves better. And the reason that I came to that conclusion was because games are at that stage where they can start to understand us. There is no other art form that can understand what its audience member is trying to say to that art piece. Most art is one way. You watch a movie, or you look at a painting, or you listen to music, but there's never an interaction between you and the art piece. But with games, there is and there can be really interesting outcomes of that. So my mission in life came about when I read the book called Meno, which is a dialogue between Socrates and Meno, in which Socrates is asked this question by Meno, which is, what is virtue? What is kindness? And what is love? And how do we get them? Are we born with them, or is it something that we learn um, as as we are we taught all of these things? So Socrates' answer to that is that we are born. We start with a belief about these ideas, and it is only through experience that we gain true knowledge about it. What I mean by that is that I may think that I'm a kind person, but if I've gone hungry for 3 days, and suddenly I find a piece of food, but there is somebody else next to me who is about to die, then my definition of kindness will be very different from what I assume what I assume kindness is. And there's no right or wrong way to look at any of those virtues. It's just very personal to me. And I felt that games can be this wonderful sandbox where you can test these definitions, where you can put players into such situations and design experiences around it that force them to think about their own beliefs and challenge them to gain better knowledge and understanding about their ideas. So that idea has taken me on a super fantastic adventure. I worked at a few very interesting places. One of them is at the Game Innovation Lab at USC, where I got to work on this game called Walden. Here's the trailer for
What if
Walden.
we could all go to the woods to live deliberately? Hey, Henry. Play as Henry David Thoreau in Walden, a game.
So Walden was a really interesting game idea. It is based on the book Walden, which was written by Henry David Thoreau. And Henry David Thoreau was a philosopher an American philosopher, also the person who came up with the idea for civil disobedience. He he led this experiment at Walden Pond, which is a place in Massachusetts in the US. And this was an experiment that he ran in the 1800s, where he decided to live in nature for 2 years. And while he was there, he wrote in his journal about his experiences living in nature. This is generally not the kind of game that you think of when you think of games. Not a lot of people would want to make a game where the main thing that you can do is take a walk. But by but this is the kind of game that expands the vocabulary of what games can be. Um, it's it's taking these ideas like picking up a berry, sustaining yourself, and being able to live for yourself and create your own life in the woods. It's a very interesting idea to pursue. And I was really fortunate to work with Professor Tracy Fullerton, who's the game director for this project. And this game has gone on to win a lot of critical acclaim. But more recently, I got to work with a company called Tenderclaws, where I'm currently working on a game called The Underpresents. And The Underpresents brings together live acting. So it brings together theater and virtual reality. Here's a trailer for the game.
Something happens with certain places where they begin to take on a life and personality of their own, where they start to act less like places and more like a person. You interact with such a place, and perhaps it is more like a person, recording, hoarding memories of the events they've witnessed, strung together, infinite paper dolls. You don't see what's going on here. Maybe next time. Pick a direction, start walking. What do you have to lose? Try west. That at least is an entertaining direction.
So I was really lucky that our efforts making this really interesting game were rewarded. We were nominated for an Emmy Award for this game because it brings together some really interesting, innovative ideas in game design. So the reason that I wanted to walk you through some of my work was because I wanted to explain to you that it generally, when we think about games, we have a very set idea of like shooting-based games and games, a very narrow idea, right? But then if we turn any interaction around us into a game, it can result in really, really interesting situations. And it can result in really interesting experiences which are meaningful for others. So I want you to think about one such interaction in your own life that you would like to convert into a game. Think about maybe one person Maybe it can be about a subject that you really like, or it can be about a memory from your childhood that you would want to convert into a game. And just keep that idea in your mind, because in the next section, I'm going to talk about how you can turn that idea into an actual game. So there are a lot of different disciplines involved in making games. One of them is game designers and game designing. So game designers generally come up with the underlying systems and the interactions for making games. And generally the tools that they use are paper, pen, whiteboard. And these are generally the initial tools that you use because you don't want to spend too much time um, developing, like physically coding stuff and putting assets together, because a lot of that, like 90% of the stuff that we do generally is never used. Nobody gets to see it outside of our teams. So paper, pens, whiteboards, those are our tools as a game designer. Then I think the one that's going to most interest all of you is engineering. And game engineering is split into a lot of different sections. Some of the primary ones are gameplay engineering, game AI, graphics programming. I would be happy to talk much more in detail about all of these in the Q&A section. But once we have a game design document ready, once we have a solid idea of what we want the game to do, that's when we start coding the game up in a game engine. So a game engine is basically a piece of software that you can use to bring together assets. And by assets, I mean music or art or uh, well, they can be your programming files. All of these come together in a software that can convert all these separate assets into one cohesive game. So um, some of the open source game engines that you can use at the moment are Godot, Panda 3D, and Cocos 2D. Generally in the industry, we tend to use one of these two softwares, which are Unity and Unreal. Both Unity and Unreal are free with an asterisk with some conditions. But you can get started with making your own games using a game engine, or you can be more creative and make a game in Python. You can make a game with an Arduino. There are a lot of different ways you can make games. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Godot, the open source engine. Actually, let me show you a trailer for the kind of games that have been made with this open source tool. So I think like you can see, there's a very broad variety of games that you can make with this game engine. And it's an open source engine, so you can go in and change everything about it. You can make it work the way you want to make it work. And this can be a really great resource into learning how game engines are made. And then there is the field of game art. It is a really interesting field. You can have 2D art, or you can have 3D art, or you can have no art at all. Um, Games are really flexible in the way you want to use art. But one of the main tools that we use for making 3D assets is called Blender. And Blender is a fantastic tool. Here is a quick trailer of what assets made with Blender look like. I'm sorry about that. So if you're sitting at home, just go to Blender's website and download Blender right now. It's a lot of fun. You'll find a lot of tutorials for it as well. So you should go in there and just have fun. See how 3D assets are made. I promise you, you'll have a lot of fun. So then there's game writers. There's people in UI UX. There's people who are producers. Um, Game development is a huge field. Generally, you'll have about, for a large game, we generally call them AAA games. A AAA game like Red Dead Redemption would have had more than 500 people working on the game for 8 years or more, sometimes less. But it's not uncommon for AAA games to have a lot of people. And then on the other hand, there are smaller indie studios. The studio that I am at is about 12 people. Uh, and you can also have single person teams, like not a team, like single person making an entire game by themselves. It's really cool. So based on the skills and your interests, I think you can find like a lot of different disciplines within games that you can engage in. And basically just take that idea that you were thinking about earlier about interacting with somebody or with something, and just use some of the tools that I mentioned um, to create interesting experiences. I know this is a super short talk. I want to leave some time for Q&A. I hope there's going to be a few questions around how to make games. I think it'll be more useful for me to talk about that. But thank you so much for listening to this talk. Uh, and I would love to connect with you. Feel free to send me an email or to connect with me on LinkedIn.
Okay, great talk. So we are having few questions in the Q&A. So the first question is, what should be our first step to become a good game developer?
Well, first of all, that's a great question. And when we think about a good game developer, I'm not super sure which field you're focused on. If you're interested in gameplay engineering, then the first thing that you would want to do is be really solid with your programming skills, know databases, data structures, the traditional things. But then you can start, well, maybe that's not the best advice. The best advice would be to start making games. There are a lot of resources out there to help you make games. And the only way you can become good at making games is if you start making them. They're like, don't stop making games. Make as many games as you can. And then eventually, when you're making something, you'll find a lot of problems that you come across, and that itself will help you become a better game designer, a better game developer. But if and this is true for all different disciplines involved in game design and game development.
Okay, so our next question is from Ayushman Sinha. So, for someone who is not very skilled in coding and has spent a lot of time in visual designing, what do you suggest? How should they own their pathway to work in the gaming industry?
So that I feel like this is kind of like who I am as well. Um, I am I graduated from UIT in 2012 with a degree in electrical and electronics engineering, and I went on to work um, for Addison. I don't know what it's called now, but I was working on 4G routers stuff. Um, and I would not really consider myself a developer. Maybe I consider myself more of a game developer now. What I want to say is that you can choose your career at any point in your life. This has been my realization. Once you find what you're really interested in, don't think that because you have a degree in in computer science or in any other field, that should not restrict you from choosing what you really want to pursue. If you're interested in visuals, you maybe take a look at how people are developing uh, visual assets for games. There's a lot of different tutorials. If you want to use an open source game engine, use that. You'll find a lot of resources for Unreal and Unity as well. And just go through some of those resources. And another really important aspect that I wanted to touch on was the idea of community. So a lot of people around you will also be interested in similar things as you, but I found that we tend to be a little scared of, it can seem daunting when you look at really high-end graphics and really complex looking games. It's really hard to think that we'll be able to make something of that sort. So maybe starting small, maybe the first game that you want to make should have like 2D or really simple artwork. And then from there, once you learn and once you make a few more games, I think you'll get a deeper understanding of what path you can follow in that field. And about community, I feel like it is always a good idea to reach out to people in your community who are maybe a few years or even a few decades ahead of you. The games industry is a really welcoming industry. I feel like nearly everybody that I've reached out to has been very kind enough to help me as well. So when you get involved with making games, you will also find people who you will look up to. And once you know who you look up to, you should just reach out to them. The worst thing that can happen is that they will not respond. Nobody's going to get angry at you. Yeah. So make games and reach out to people.
Okay, I would like to tell everyone that if you want to ask questions live, I can unmute you all. So unmute the person who is asking, so you can raise your hand to ask the question live. So we are having many questions from Vaibhav Puri and Archit, and they're asking,
Okay.
can we just produce great games like GTA 5?
Well, that's a tricky question. I'm generally not the person who dissuades people, but I would like to maybe where you will not be able to produce a game like GTA 5 by yourself, unfortunately. Not at the moment, not until artificial intelligence becomes so amazing that it can do all the work. I don't know when or if that will be, but at the moment, no, you cannot produce great games like GTA 5. And maybe I can talk a little bit about why that is. Something like GTA 5 has lots and lots and lots of art assets. They have somebody who They have teams of people who've made game design decisions. They have a huge marketing budget. They have imagined like a very complex system. This is like saying, can I make half of Google by myself? Well, you can get started making Google. Maybe you can get started making the very first web page that uses something like page ranking for Google. But to do all of those things would be impossible for one person. Yeah, that's not to dissuade you from getting in game. Mother is working on a game like GTA 5.
Uh, so the next question is language we need to learn for game development.
Well, if you want to work with a smaller studio, I would encourage you to use something like Unity. And for Unity, generally you end up using C Sharp. If you want to use something like Unreal Engine, your best bet would be to start learning C++. To be honest, I feel like language, your choice of language is never really a barrier to, if you know one language really well, it shouldn't be too difficult to learn another one, especially between C Sharp and C++. They're sort of similar. The syntax is kind of similar. So don't worry about learning about learning a specific language. Get one of those tools. Get a game engine. Some people like to build their own game engines. If your objective is to learn how to build a game engine, that's a good way to go. But if your interest is in making games, I think that you should not spend time making your own game engines. Game engines are complex, and when you're starting out, you will have generally most people have some unrealistic expectations. I know I did. And I wanted to make some really, really complex games, but you can very quickly find yourself demotivated because it's a really complex task, and you might end up running into complexity issues which you might not be able to solve by yourself. So it'll be a good idea to just to use an existing game engine. The game engines that are in the market right now are fantastic. They have lots of people. They have hundreds of people working on them, and they've had years and years of iterations on them. So make use of that. And in terms of in terms of other things that you should learn, for most 3D based games, you will need to know 3D game math. And this will be something like vector manipulation, quaternions. I know it's scary, but like most of those concepts are not too complex. If you want to get into game AI, so game AI is very different from traditional AI. Game AI is more about agents that navigate an environment. You can look up different. There's a conference called Game Developers Conference, which puts out its videos on YouTube. And you can find a few links to interesting talks in game development and in game design and music, all sorts of different areas. Maybe take a look at that, see what interests you. And from there, you can just mess around with it, just play with it, like I mentioned in the first slide, have fun making it.
So we have a question.
I'm sorry. There is a question by Purnima. So Purnima, I also want to give a huge shout out to Purnima. Purnima is one of my mentors, and she is the lead game designer at Zynga. So I feel like a lot of these questions could actually be directed at Purnima as well. But I also want to encourage women game developers to enter into the industry. So if you're listening to this talk and you feel like one of those interactions sounds interesting to you, and you want to make a game about a memory that you have. Uh, like, don't restrict yourself. You'll find a lot of support for um, for this, and don't think that this is, at the moment it may be slightly um, skewed in favor of men, but that is changing very quickly. So I want to give a huge shout out first of all to Purnima, who's actually a Hall of Fame uh, person from Women in Games. It's a huge award. So Purnima's question was, what inspired me to become a game developer? And um, for me, I think it was this realization that I can, when I'm playing a game, my game can understand what I'm trying to say to it. I feel like no other medium has that capability. And if your art piece can understand what you're trying to say to it, then imagine that art piece evolving to have a conversation with you. Um, that idea has taken root in my mind, and I feel like it's my entire life will be a mission to explore that idea. And that's basically what's inspired me to become a game developer.
So the question is, are there any courses you would recommend for game development?
Yes, you can go on to Unity. So I'm primarily, most of my work is in Unity. If you want to use Unity, or if you want to use Unity, you can head on to Unity, their website, and they have a Unity Learn section, which will walk you through a lot of the game development courses, which includes how to get familiar with their game engine, basic coding practices, and it'll walk you through how to get started with making a game uh, from from absolutely scratch. Uh, and I think if you have something of an experience of that sort, where you have an objective of the kind of game that you want to make and you're getting constant feedback, that will really help you. Once you finish your game, it'll keep you motivated to make more games like that. So Unity would be one. Unreal also has sources, has resources like that. And then you can find a lot of courses on Coursera. I personally learned a few from Udacity. You have to be a little tricky, and there's going to be a few courses which are for free, but they don't advertise it as free. But you'll have to look around, and maybe you'll be able to find those courses and be able to take them for free. And so the course that I took on Udacity was about reinforcement learning. I was making a game where I wanted to make the game learn how to play it by itself. And for that, I used traditional artificial intelligence and reinforcement learning, which I learned about from Udacity. Yeah, I think Udacity, Coursera, Unity, and Unreal, all of those resources will be great.
Okay, one question from Mayur. We have been seen Blender going more mainstream in recent years. What is the reason for its success as a free and open source software, and can it be replicated in other places like game engines like Godot?
Well, that's a great question. So Blender, I think, has a very strong community. Another reason is that it's the tool that it is replacing is Maya. And Maya is a product of Autodesk. Autodesk makes 3ds Max and Maya. And both of those softwares are extremely expensive. They're in the range of $3,000 to $4,000 for individual use. And I feel that games, more than any other field in software, has democratized the development of games. And so where you had softwares like Unity, which used to cost $1,500 before, and tools like Unreal, which used to cost $3,000 earlier, have gone free. But Maya and 3ds Max still cost the same. And I feel that Blender is the reason that Blender exists is because it's unfair. it's unfair in the sense that if um, for people like me, when I was a student in India, it would be impossible for me to use Maya. When I was in school, there is no way I could convince my parents to pay me, like to give me $3,000 to pay for a software which I did not know how to use. Um, and I feel like that may be one of the reasons why Blender is so popular. And because it's popular, it acts as a feedback loop. The more popular it becomes, um, the stronger the community becomes, and the stronger the community, the better the tool becomes. So it's a great feedback cycle, and this is true for nearly all open source softwares. If there is a need for it, if there is genuine use for that software, you'll have a great community which comes together, and you'll have lots and lots of people helping make that tool much better. And as for the second part to your question, can it be replicated in other places and other game engines? Perhaps, but because Unity and Unreal are generally free for independent developers at the moment, um, it seems like most people will tend to gravitate towards using those game engines instead. It's not the best because you don't really have control over what goes into, you don't really have control over the software itself. But because there's a lot of funding, like Unity just had its IPO and it's valued at 13 billion, and Unreal is valued at 17 billion. So you have a huge team of people working to make those tools better. So I feel like most people will tend to gravitate towards these really inexpensive game engines for now.
Okay, what should be the approach to think of a new and creative game idea?
Um, well, maybe think about, maybe Purnima would be a really great person to ask this, but I can give my advice, which is think about a memory. Maybe this works a lot really well for me. There's generally two kinds of games that you can make. One is more rule based, and another one is emotions and storytelling based. So first of all, find out which kind of a person you are, what kind of game you want to make. If you want to make a rule based game, um, creative ideas could be, going to a park and see how children are playing, seeing what kind of things make people interested, or looking at games which already exist and seeing, what kinds of interactions exist in those, and exploring how you can take an idea and completely morph it into your own. I know it's kind of hard to explain, but like, don't restrict yourself with the kind of games that already exist. Think about interactions that you have in your daily life. Maybe it's something like cooking food when you wake up in the morning. Maybe you can turn that into a game, or school chores, writing an essay. You're going to have a speaker who's worked with GPT-2, right? So maybe ask them, maybe you can make a game about that uses GPT-2 to write essays or something. There's a lot of different ways that you can think about it. So just don't restrict your creativity to games which already exist, because games which already exist will already have a lot of people working to make incremental improvements to it. But if you're imagining a whole new idea, you will be the first person, and you'll have the first mover advantage in that case. And as for narrative based games, um, think about, well, generally what I do is I keep a game design journal in which I will write about um, my daily things that inspire me, or things that make me feel an emotion really strongly, and I'll I'll pen it down in my diary, and then I'll go back and try and take that emotion, because generally when we feel an emotion, it is very universal, and everybody can, if you're feeling sad, or if you're feeling lonely, or if you're feeling really happy, these are emotions which everybody around the world, no matter where they're from, will feel very similarly to it. So if you can take those same ideas and maybe put them in some kind of a narrative, that itself will be, I mean, it'll be a game that I would want to play.
Okay, so the next question is from Gurname Chatwal, and he's asking, apart from game development, what would you like to suggest for creating AR and VR experiences?
So one of my friends created a game called Healing Spaces, which was about patients with dementia. Another game or experience that I created was centered around patients with Parkinson's disease. We found out that patients with Parkinson's disease they tend to fall because they lose motor control. So we worked with physical therapists to help create a walking intervention for patients with Parkinson's disease, where they would wear the headset and we would have trackers on their feet, and like it had game design elements to it, so that like if you didn't um, pick up your feet enough, it would either make a sound, or you'd have really small village people. So the idea was that you're a giant and you're walking through a lot of different villages, and you don't want to crush the people who are living in the villages. And it's just it's a very playful way to think about a boring exercise. um, there's been a lot of research that suggests that people, when they go through physical therapy, they tend to get bored. But if you can look at that interaction and add something that's fun, that might make that interaction more interesting. Eh, and other than that, well, maybe I can talk about some of the experiences that I've created in augmented reality. I was working with Julie Wang, who is like an award-winning sound designer, and we were working with the Keck School of Medicine at USC in Los Angeles, with for children and infants with hearing disabilities, so children who get cochlear implants who cannot hear, helping them understand the concept of spatial training. With generally, when we think about sound, we can close our eyes and we can pinpoint where the sound is coming from, because for people who do not have any difficulties hearing, you have 2 ears, so that can be used to identify where a sound is coming from. But for children who are born with some kind of a difficulty, that training is really hard. So we made some augmented reality experiences where we'd have a sound or a story or a character coming in from one space, and it was accompanied with a sound, and over a few iterations, our the children would learn to identify where the sound is coming from. And I feel like it's experiences like that that really move you. I love making games, and it gives me a lot of joy to see players having fun. And then games like this, where it's actually having a meaningful impact in the world, those are also, it just makes you feel really, it, the experience of making it is really rewarding. So I don't know if this answers your question to some part, Kuruname, but uh, feel free to connect with me if you want to talk more about this.
Okay, we are having just 3 more minutes left. Maybe we can take just 1 to 2 more questions. So
Mhm.
I'll take this question: how to particularly stand out as a indie game dev in a crowded market of game development, or should just look to try to join a good game development studio inside India or abroad?
Well, that's a $1 million question. I feel that I've been lucky to work with some indie studios um, which were doing interesting work. Well, I think it's really hard to be noticed as an indie developer if you're making a clone of a game. I would discourage you from making clones of games. it's unless you want to just learn how to make a game. But there are so many different things that we can explore around our world, uh, in our emotions. So the first thing that I would recommend is have an original game idea. That's the first thing that you would need to stand out from a crowd. Um, the next thing that you would need is a community which knows that your game is about to come out. So, for example, at Tender Clause, we're fortunate because we make very quirky, really, well, most people will call them really weird, weird games. Um, and we have a very small segment of people who likes those kinds of games, and they're excited for our games even before we release them. They'll like our players will uh, you know create their own subreddits. They will make their own fan arts. It's really endearing to see that. So if you're an indie developer, if you can build a community around your game, that will that will help you gain some traction. And then the games industry is a very small industry, and most people tend to know each other. So if you're an indie, don't hesitate to reach out to other people, build that network, and talk to as many developers as you can. And like I mentioned before, people are really helpful in this industry. So you'll find somebody who wants to help you make your game a success.
Okay, one more question, last question. So, among you who have a startup in game or AI, do check the biggest step taken by India to promote such startups. It is called the Image in Hyderabad, where they'll shortlist 30 startups each year and help you provide every resources to you all.
Oh, that's great. I'm so Nilakshi. Oh, Nilakshi sent this. I think, yeah. Um, and maybe I can leave some resources in the Slack channels for people. Um, if I think Purnima might also be able to guide us more about the games scene in India. I unfortunately am not very familiar with it, but yeah, you should definitely reach out to Image and apply to be shortlisted in those startups. Thanks for that, Nilakshi.
Okay, so we are up on time, so we can take all the rest of the questions maybe later in the chat, in the Slack. And I would like to thank you very much for joining us this morning and night for you. So thank you. We can catch up later on Slack. Thank you very much for the
Thank you so
awesome talk.
much. And I want to give a shout out to the entire organizing team. You guys have done a fantastic job. Thanks for organizing this amazing Software Freedom Day.